This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Don't touch my son. The words cut through the soft clink of silverware and low hum of Manhattan conversation like a crack in polished glass. Every head in Whitmore's prime steakhouse turned at once. Daniel Whitmore was already on his feet, 6'2" in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, his jaw tight, his Rolex catching the chandelier light as he stepped forward. Across from him, Emily Carter stood perfectly still, one hand hovering inches from 7-year-old Noah Whitmore's small shoulder. She hadn't flinched when he raised his voice. She hadn't stepped back either. The restaurant smelled of seared ribeye and truffle butter, warm bread, and expensive cologne. Outside, Fifth Avenue traffic rolled past in steady lines of headlights. Inside, everything had stopped. Emily had been on her feet for 9 hours, her black flats pinching slightly at the heel, her dark blonde hair pulled into a low ponytail that had begun to loosen near the temples. She had mastered invisibility long ago, the quiet efficiency of someone who moved between tables without disturbing the air. But she was not invisible now. Noah sat rigid in the leather booth, pale, his small fingers clenched around the edge of the white tablecloth. A half-eaten shrimp rested on his plate. Daniel's eyes were locked on Emily's hand as if it were a threat. He had built $1 billion cybersecurity empire by anticipating danger before anyone else could see it. He did not tolerate unpredictability. He especially did not tolerate strangers reaching for his child. "Step away," Daniel said, lower this time, but no less firm. Around them, investors in tailored suits exchanged uneasy glances. A server near the bar froze mid-pour. Emily's voice, when she spoke, was calm. "Sir, I think he's having a reaction." She wasn't guessing. She had noticed the signs 2 minutes earlier when she refilled their sparkling water. The faint redness creeping up Noah's neck, the way he swallowed too hard, the subtle hitch in his breathing that most people would mistake for nerves. She had seen that look before. Not in this restaurant, not under crystal chandeliers, but in a small apartment in Queens at 2 in the morning with her mother gasping for air after accidental exposure to shellfish. Daniel's gaze flicked to his son for the first time since standing. "Noah." His voice softened by a fraction. Noah tried to answer, but the word came out thin. His chest rose too quickly. The room felt suddenly smaller. Emily made a decision. She reached into the small apron pocket she always carried for tips and order slips and pulled out a slim, bright orange auto-injector. She moved with the kind of precision that didn't belong to someone who only memorized daily specials. Daniel's expression hardened instantly. "What are you doing?" he demanded, stepping forward. "Helping him breathe," she replied. She crouched to Noah's level, her movements steady, her tone almost conversational. "Hey, buddy, I'm going to help you out, okay? You're going to feel better in just a second." Noah's wide blue eyes met hers. There was fear there, but also trust. She administered the injection swiftly and safely, exactly as she had practiced dozens of times before. A murmur rippled through the dining room. Daniel's face had gone pale, anger mixing with something far more vulnerable. "Security," he said sharply, without looking away. "Get the manager." Now, Emily remained beside Noah, speaking softly about dinosaurs and how T-Rex probably hated seafood too. It sounded absurd under the chandelier glow, but Noah's breathing began to steady, each inhale less frantic than the last. Daniel watched, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios the way it did in boardrooms during hostile takeovers. Control. He needed control. Within seconds, the restaurant manager appeared, breathless. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm so sorry. She's fired," Daniel said flatly, gesturing toward Emily without taking his eyes off his son. The word landed heavy in the air. Fired. Just like that. Emily didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She only kept her focus on Noah, counting quietly under her breath, monitoring the color returning to his cheeks. A few tables away, a woman whispered, "Was that necessary?" Daniel heard it. He ignored it. Power had insulated him from whispers for years. But then Noah took a full, steady breath. Not shallow, not strained, normal. He blinked and looked up at his father. "Dad," he said, voice clearer now, "I'm okay." Silence fell like a curtain. Daniel dropped to one knee beside the booth. Loosening his tie with trembling fingers, he hoped no one noticed. He looked at the injector in Emily's hand, then at the shrimp on the plate. He's severely allergic to shellfish, Daniel muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The kitchen was notified. The manager stammered something about a mix-up, a mislabeled garnish. Emily rose slowly to her feet. He'll need to be checked at a hospital, just to be safe, she said gently. But the injection worked. You acted fast calling for help. It was a small kindness, giving him credit in front of the room. Daniel stood too, his height imposing again, but the certainty in his expression had shifted. The investors were no longer studying their phones. They were watching him, watching her, watching the power dynamic tilt, almost imperceptibly. The manager cleared his throat. Emily, Daniel interrupted, his voice quieter now. Get my car ready, he told his assistant. Then he looked directly at Emily for the first time, really looked at her, at the steadiness in her posture, the intelligence in her eyes that hadn't flickered even when he'd raised his voice. You carry that just in case? He asked. She nodded once. My mom has severe allergies. I don't leave home without one. There was no bitterness in her tone, no triumph, just fact. Noah reached for her hand before Daniel could say anything else. She saved me, the boy said simply. The words hung there, uncomplicated and undeniable. Daniel felt something unfamiliar press against his carefully constructed composure. Not weakness, not exactly. Something closer to humility. Around them, the restaurant slowly exhaled, the low hum of conversation returning in cautious waves. But nothing felt the same. Emily stepped back slightly, giving father and son space. The manager hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to proceed with the earlier order. Daniel straightened, smoothing his jacket, reclaiming the posture that had built empires. Yet his voice, when he finally spoke again, lacked the sharp edge it had carried minutes before. We're not finished here, he said, meeting Emily's gaze. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And for the first time that evening, Emily allowed herself the smallest, almost amused smile, because she understood something he did not yet realize. Sometimes the hand you fear is the one that changes everything. Daniel Whitmore had never moved through a crowd unnoticed in his life. Yet as he carried Noah out of the restaurant that night, he felt the weight of 100 silent judgments pressing against his back. The cool Manhattan air hit his face the moment the glass doors opened, sharp and clean, a contrast to the heavy tension he had left behind. His black sedan was already waiting at the curb, engine running, headlights reflecting off the slick pavement. Noah rested against his chest, small arms looped around his neck, breathing steady now, the crisis reduced to a memory measured in minutes. Daniel slid into the back seat and gave the driver a single instruction. Mount Sinai. Now. The car eased into traffic, gliding past taxis and buses, past couples laughing on sidewalks, past a city that did not pause for anyone, not even billionaires. Daniel looked down at his son. The faint redness on Noah's neck had faded. His breathing was even, controlled, the way it should have been all along. Dad, Noah murmured, tilting his head slightly. Emily is nice. The name landed softly, but it unsettled him more than the earlier accusation from strangers had. Daniel stared out the tinted window, watching skyscrapers blur into streaks of light. He had built an empire on vigilance, on expecting the unexpected, yet tonight a simple plate of seafood had nearly undone him. And a waitress had seen what he had not. He loosened his tie again, this time not out of panic but reflection. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what Emily had already known. The injection had been administered correctly. Timing had been critical. 30 seconds later, and the outcome might have been very different. Daniel thanked the attending physician with automatic politeness, the kind that came from years of executive meetings and charity galas, but his mind remained elsewhere. It replayed the moment she had crouched beside Noah, the steadiness in her voice, the absence of hesitation. She had not looked at him for permission. She had looked at his son. By the time they returned to the Upper East Side townhouse, the city had settled into late evening calm. The building's limestone facade glowed under soft exterior lights. Inside, everything was in place, curated, controlled. Yet Daniel felt none of that control. He carried Noah upstairs himself, ignoring the housekeeper's concerned glance, and sat on the edge of the boy's bed until he fell asleep. Noah clutched a small plastic dinosaur in one hand. She said Tyrannosaurus Rex did not like seafood either, he mumbled sleepily. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. Downstairs, he poured himself a glass of sparkling Water instead of whiskey. His reflection in the dark window looked older than he remembered. He thought about the word he had used so casually. Fired. As if her livelihood had been an inconvenience he could erase with a sentence. He had seen the way she had not argued. Not because she was guilty, because she did not need to prove herself. That realization unsettled him more than defiance would have. He walked into his home office, the walls lined with framed headlines and awards. One photograph caught his eye, taken years earlier when his company had first gone public. He had looked hungry then. Determined. Not hardened. Somewhere along the climb from modest beginnings to billion-dollar valuations, he had replaced humility with assumption. His assistant called to check in. Sir, should I prepare a statement regarding the restaurant incident? Daniel paused. No, he said finally. Send me everything you have on the staff, particularly the waitress. Emily Carter. There was a brief silence on the line. Background check, his assistant asked carefully. Daniel considered it. He had built his fortune uncovering information, pulling at threads until patterns emerged. But this felt different. No, he replied. Just her employment file. I want to know why someone with that kind of training is serving tables. He ended the call and stood still for a long moment. Outside, a faint drizzle began to fall, tapping lightly against the windows. He thought about how easily he had dismissed her, how quickly he had let anger override observation. In the restaurant, he had felt powerful. In the hospital corridor, he had felt small. Power, he realized, had not helped his son breathe. Knowledge had. And courage. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall townhouse windows in pale gold streaks. Daniel had slept little. He dressed with precision, navy suit, crisp white shirt, silver cufflinks. But something in his posture had shifted. Less rigid. More deliberate. Noah bounded down the stairs, energetic again. The previous night already transformed into a story he would likely retell at school. Are we going to see Emily today? Noah asked casually over breakfast. Daniel folded his newspaper slowly. Why would you want that? He asked. Noah shrugged, reaching for orange juice. Because she did not yell, and she did not look scared. Daniel absorbed that. Children saw what adults overlooked. He glanced at his watch. 8:40. 5 in the morning. The restaurant would not open for hours, but he was not a man who waited once he had decided. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and made a choice that felt unfamiliar yet strangely necessary. He was going back, not as a customer seeking service, not as a billionaire issuing commands, but as a father who owed someone more than a quiet nod across a dining room. As his driver pulled the sedan onto the avenue, Daniel watched the city wake up, vendors rolling carts into position, delivery trucks double-parked, pedestrians clutching coffee cups against the chill. Somewhere among them was a woman who had walked out of a restaurant without protest after being dismissed unfairly. Somewhere in this vast city, she was likely beginning another shift, tying back her hair, slipping on worn flats, preparing to move unnoticed again. Daniel Whitmore had built his life on decisive action. Today, for the first time in years, his next move was not about acquisition or dominance. It was about acknowledgement. And he did not yet realize that this simple decision would alter far more than the memory of one chaotic evening under crystal chandeliers. Emily Carter arrived at Whitmore's Prime Steakhouse at 10:45 in the morning, 15 minutes earlier than her shift required, because punctuality was one of the few things she could control. The city air still carried a faint trace of last night's rain, and her black flats tapped softly against the sidewalk as she approached the glass doors. She had replayed the previous evening only once, briefly, while tying her hair back in her small studio apartment in Queens. Not the accusation, not the word fired, only the moment Noah's breathing steadied. That was enough. Inside, the restaurant looked different in daylight. Without the evening crowd and crystal reflections, it felt almost ordinary. Chairs were still stacked on a few tables. The scent of fresh polish lingered in the air. The manager, Thomas Reed, stood near the host's stand, reviewing a clipboard with furrowed brows. He looked up when the door chimed. Surprise flickered across his face. Emily, he said cautiously. She offered a polite nod. I came to pick up my last check. The words were steady. No bitterness. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. About that, he began, but the front door opened again before he could finish. The room seemed to inhale. At once, Daniel Whitmore stepped inside, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with effortless precision, his presence commanding even in silence. He did not bring investors this time. He did not bring an entourage. He came alone. Thomas straightened immediately. Mr. Whitmore, we were just— Daniel lifted a hand slightly, not dismissive, but clear. His eyes found Emily within seconds. She stood near the bar, hands loosely folded, posture calm. No defensive stance. No expectation. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The morning light caught in the polished wood behind her, outlining her silhouette in quiet contrast to the sharp lines of his tailored suit. Miss Carter, Daniel said finally, his voice measured. May I speak with you? Thomas looked between them, unsure whether to stay or retreat. Emily answered before he could decide. You can stay, she said softly, glancing at the manager. There is nothing to hide. Daniel noticed that. The absence of fear. The absence of urgency. He stepped closer, careful to maintain respectful distance. I was wrong, he said, the words deliberate, unembellished. Thomas's eyebrows lifted. Apologies were not common currency for men like Daniel Whitmore. Emily's expression did not change dramatically. She simply listened. You acted quickly, Daniel continued. You acted correctly, and I reacted without understanding the full situation. He paused, searching for something more precise than corporate phrasing. My son is alive and well this morning because of you. Silence settled gently rather than sharply this time. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. Emily studied him for a moment, as if weighing not his words but the sincerity behind them. He would have been fine, she said. The kitchen mistake was the real issue. Daniel shook his head slightly. No, awareness was. He held her gaze, and for the first time, there was no edge in it. Only recognition. Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. Emily, about your employment, she is not fired, Daniel interrupted calmly. If anything, she deserves acknowledgement. The manager nodded quickly, relief washing across his face. Emily inhaled slowly. I do not need acknowledgement, she replied. I need fairness. Daniel felt the truth of that settle deeper than any public praise could. He reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of pulling out a check or business card immediately, he hesitated. Power, he realized, was often displayed through transactions. He did not want this moment to become another transaction. Would you consider meeting with me? He asked instead. Outside of this setting? Thomas's eyes widened slightly. The request carried no inappropriate tone, no assumption. It was careful. Emily tilted her head just a fraction. To discuss what? Opportunity, Daniel said. And perhaps perspective. The corner of her mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. Perspective usually costs more than opportunity, she replied. The faintest hint of humor threaded through her voice. Daniel found himself almost smiling in return. Almost. Then I am prepared to listen, he said. There was a quiet confidence in the way she stood, not confrontational, not submissive. Balanced. I worked double shifts this week, Emily answered. If you want to speak, you can come here. During my break. 15 minutes. The condition surprised him. Most people adjusted their schedules to accommodate his. She had set a boundary without hostility. 15 minutes, he agreed. Thomas exhaled quietly, tension dissolving from his shoulders. The crisis that had threatened his establishment less than 12 hours earlier now felt distant, almost surreal. Daniel extended his hand, not as a superior, but as an equal. Emily looked at it briefly, then shook it. Her grip was firm, steady, not intimidated. As their hands parted, Daniel felt something shift that had nothing to do with business strategy. It was subtle, a recalibration. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm, unaware that inside a polished Manhattan restaurant, a billionaire had just learned the difference between authority and respect. Emily moved toward the back to clock in, her posture unchanged, as though she had simply completed another task. Daniel watched her for a moment longer than necessary. She did not look back. He turned toward the door, the morning sunlight catching the silver of his watch as he stepped outside. For the first time in years, his next meeting was not about profit margins or quarterly growth. It was about understanding a woman who had acted without hesitation, spoken without fear, and refused to accept either dismissal or flattery as her identity. And Daniel Whitmore, a man accustomed to controlling every outcome, found himself unexpectedly curious about what might happen next. At precisely 2:15 in the afternoon, the lunch rush softened into a manageable rhythm. and Emily Carter untied her apron with measured movements before stepping toward the narrow hallway that led to the staff break area. 15 minutes. That was what she had offered. Not an hour. Not an open invitation. 15 minutes, because time was currency, and she guarded hers carefully. Daniel Whitmore was already seated at a small corner table near the window when she returned to the dining room floor, his jacket draped neatly over the back of the chair, sleeves rolled once at the wrist in a rare departure from his usual precision. He had declined a menu. He had declined coffee. He was waiting. Sunlight filtered through the tall glass panes, casting soft reflections across the polished wood. Outside, pedestrians hurried past, unaware that inside, a conversation was about to shift the trajectory of two very different lives. Emily approached without hesitation and sat across from him, folding her hands loosely on the table. "You have 14 minutes now," she said calmly. Daniel almost smiled at the specificity. "I will not waste them," he replied. For a moment, neither spoke. The clink of dishes from the kitchen filled the space between them. Daniel studied her the way he studied data before a major acquisition, not with suspicion, but with intent to understand. "You mentioned your mother has severe allergies," he began. "How long?" "Since I was 12, Emily answered. "Shellfish, peanuts, a few others. I learned early." Her voice carried no drama, only fact. Daniel nodded slowly. "You handled last night with clinical precision." A faint pause. "That is not common training for restaurant staff." Emily's gaze remained steady. "I attended Columbia for pre-med," she said simply. 2 years. Daniel absorbed that without interruption. "Why did you leave?" She did not look away. "Tuition, medical bills, life." There was no self-pity in the answer, just reality. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. "You gave up medical school to serve tables?" "I postponed it," she corrected gently. "There is a difference." The subtle correction landed. Daniel recognized ambition when he saw it, especially the quiet kind that did not announce itself. "You could have sued the restaurant," he said after a moment, "for wrongful termination." "I was reinstated before paperwork was filed," she replied. "And I do not measure every injustice by compensation." The words were not accusatory. They were reflective. Daniel felt them settle. For years, his solutions had come in the form of numbers, contracts, settlements. He had built certainty through financial leverage. She operated from principle. "I came today," said carefully, "because gratitude feels incomplete without action." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Gratitude does not require a contract." "No," Daniel agreed. "But opportunity might." He rested his forearms lightly on the table, posture open rather than imposing. "I fund several philanthropic initiatives. One of them focuses on pediatric health innovation, research, education, accessibility. I would like you involved." Emily studied him in silence for several seconds. The restaurant noise faded into background rhythm. "In what capacity?" she asked. "Advisory," Daniel answered. "You understand allergic response in a way that goes beyond textbooks. You respond under pressure, and you are not intimidated by authority." A flicker of humor crossed her expression. "You noticed that?" "It is difficult not to," he replied. She considered his proposal without visible excitement. "Is this about your son?" she asked quietly. "Or about your reputation?" The question was direct, but not hostile. Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked out the window, watching a cab slow at the curb, then back at her. "It began with my son," he admitted. "But it is no longer only about him." That honesty surprised even him. Emily leaned back slightly, measuring his tone more than his words. "You reacted quickly last night," she said. "Most parents would." "I reacted with anger," Daniel corrected. "That is not the same." She held his gaze, assessing whether the distinction was genuine. "Anger is often fear in disguise," she said softly. Daniel felt the truth of that more deeply than he expected. The memory of Noah struggling to breathe replayed for a fraction of a second, and with it, the sharp vulnerability he had buried beneath authority. "You are perceptive," he observed. "I have had practice," she replied. "When you grow up managing emergencies at home, you learn to read people quickly." A server passed by their table, glancing curiously at the unlikely pairing, then continued on. Daniel became aware of how different they appeared on the surface. His tailored suit, her simple black uniform. Yet in that moment, the difference felt less relevant than the conversation itself. "If I accept," Emily said carefully. It will not be as charity. It would not be, Daniel assured her. It would be as contribution. She checked the small clock on the wall near the bar. 2 minutes remaining. I will consider it, she said. But I will not abandon my shift. Or my path. Medical school is still the goal. Daniel nodded once. Then perhaps the path can widen. The phrase lingered between them. Not dominance. Not persuasion. Possibility. Emily stood first, tying her apron back into place with practiced efficiency. Your 15 minutes are over, she said lightly. Daniel rose as well, retrieving his jacket from the chair. I appreciate your time, he replied. As she turned to return to her section, he added quietly, Noah would like to thank you himself. She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. Then bring him by, she said. On a day he is not afraid of shrimp. The faintest smile touched Daniel's expression. It was unfamiliar territory, this exchange of wit without power attached. He watched her move back into the rhythm of the restaurant, carrying plates, refilling glasses, blending once more into the background. She seemed to command rather than occupy. And as Daniel stepped outside into the steady hum of the city, he realized something that had never occurred to him during board meetings or acquisitions. Influence did not always begin in conference rooms. Sometimes it began at a small table near a window, with 15 measured minutes, and a woman who refused to be impressed by anything except sincerity. 3 days later, Daniel Whitmore walked back into Whitmore's Prime Steakhouse with his 7-year-old son at his side, not as a man seeking control, but as a father keeping a promise. Noah wore a small navy sweater and sneakers that squeaked faintly against the polished floor as they stepped inside. The early evening crowd had begun to gather, the low hum of conversation building under the glow of crystal chandeliers. Heads turned again, as they often did when Daniel entered a room, but this time he did not notice. He was watching for one person. Emily Carter stood near the center of the dining room, balancing a tray with effortless precision, her posture straight, movements fluid, as though the weight she carried never quite touched her shoulders. She spotted Noah first. A subtle shift in her expression softened her features. Not surprise. Recognition. Noah tugged gently at his father's hand. That is her, he said, unnecessary but certain. Daniel nodded once and approached without urgency. When Emily reached their table, her tone was professional but warm. Good evening, she said. No seafood tonight. Noah grinned, sliding into the booth. I checked, he replied proudly. Daniel allowed himself a small breath of relief at the normalcy of it all. No raised voices. No tension thickening the air. Just a table, a menu, and the quiet rhythm of a restaurant doing what restaurants were meant to do. We wanted to thank you properly, Daniel began once they were seated. Emily tilted her head slightly. He looks healthy, she observed. That is thanks enough. Noah leaned forward, elbows on the table despite his father's usual correction. I told my teacher about you, he announced. She said you were brave. Emily's lips curved gently. Sometimes brave just means prepared, she replied. Daniel studied her again, noticing details he had overlooked before. The faint callus along her right thumb from years of writing and practice. The subtle confidence in the way she maintained eye contact without challenging it. We would like you to join us for dinner, Daniel said carefully. After your shift. The offer carried no assumption this time. Only invitation. Emily glanced toward the kitchen doors, calculating the remainder of her evening responsibilities. I finish at 9, she said. If you are still here. Daniel nodded. We will be. Dinner passed without incident, and for once, Daniel allowed himself to set aside emails and market updates. He listened as Noah described his science project, the way he had drawn a large red dinosaur to explain predator instincts. Emily stopped by occasionally, refilling water, offering light commentary that made Noah laugh without trying too hard. Daniel found himself watching the exchange with a quiet awareness he had not felt in years. It had been a long time since his home echoed with laughter unforced by obligation. At 9:05, the restaurant thinned to a comfortable murmur. Emily returned without her apron, dressed in simple dark jeans and a soft gray sweater. The uniform gone, she appeared less defined by the room and more defined by herself. Daniel stood as she approached, not out of performance, but respect. They chose a smaller table near the window this time. No business associates. No audience. Just 3 plates and the city lights flickering beyond the glass. You mentioned medical school, Daniel said once they were settled. Are you planning to return soon? Emily traced the rim of her water glass lightly before answering. Applications reopen in the spring. I am saving what I can. Daniel absorbed that. And your mother? Stable, she replied. Which means manageable. There was strength in the understatement. Noah, halfway through his grilled chicken, looked between them with open curiosity. Dad, you always say problems have solutions, he said. Maybe you can solve this one. Daniel met Emily's gaze across the table. The comment might have sounded childish from anyone else, but from his son, it carried clarity. Solutions are not always financial, Emily said gently before Daniel could respond. Sometimes they are structural. Daniel leaned back slightly. Explain. She hesitated only briefly. Access to preventative education, she said. Affordable allergy awareness programs in schools. Not just research in laboratories. Her words were measured, thoughtful, rooted in lived experience rather than theory. Daniel felt something shift again, a recognition that her perspective expanded rather than threatened his. Would you be willing, he asked slowly, to help design such a program? Emily studied him carefully, searching for hidden motive. She found none. If it benefits more than your last name, she answered. Yes. Noah smiled as though the agreement had already been signed. Outside, rain began to fall lightly, tapping against the glass in soft rhythm. The restaurant staff dimmed the lights slightly as closing time approached. Daniel found himself reluctant to end the evening. It was unfamiliar territory, this ease, this conversation unmeasured by negotiation tactics. You are different from most people I meet, he said quietly. Emily raised an eyebrow with faint amusement. Most people you meet are trying to impress you, she replied. I am not. The honesty was simple, disarming. Daniel felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady. He realized then that his curiosity had evolved into something more nuanced. Respect, certainly. Gratitude, undeniably. But also a quiet admiration for the way she occupied space without seeking permission. As they stepped outside into the rain, Noah darted ahead beneath the restaurant awning, laughing at the droplets splashing against the pavement. Daniel paused beside Emily for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Thank you, he said softly. Not for the injection. Not only for that. For the conversation. For the perspective. For the reminder that influence without humility was incomplete. Emily met his gaze, rain catching lightly in her hair. You are welcome, she replied. And in the space between those two simple words, something new began to form, not built on obligation or transaction, but on the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful connections begin with a moment of vulnerability under bright lights and the courage to return the next day. The following week unfolded with a rhythm neither Daniel Whitmore nor Emily Carter had anticipated, subtle yet undeniable. It began with a formal invitation printed on thick cream stationery, delivered to the restaurant in the early afternoon. The Whitmore Foundation was hosting a private strategy session on pediatric allergy awareness, and Daniel had included Emily's name not as staff, not as guest, but as consultant. When Thomas handed her the envelope, curiosity flickered briefly across her face before composure returned. She read the details once, then folded the paper neatly and slipped it into her apron pocket. That evening, after her shift ended, she stood outside the towering glass entrance of Whitmore Tower on Park Avenue, its steel and marble facade reflecting the city lights in precise symmetry. The building rose nearly 60 stories, a monument to ambition and careful design. Emily paused only a second before stepping inside. The lobby smelled faintly of polished stone and quiet wealth. A receptionist greeted her by name. Daniel had arranged everything. In the elevator, she watched the floor numbers climb steadily, her reflection calm in the mirrored walls. She did not adjust her posture. She did not shrink. She arrived as herself. Daniel was waiting in a conference room lined with panoramic windows overlooking Midtown. The skyline glittered beyond the glass, the Empire State Building glowing softly in the distance. Noah sat in one of the leather chairs, swinging his legs slightly, a folder of drawings spread out before him. When he saw Emily, his face brightened instantly. I made a plan, he announced before any formal greeting could begin. Daniel rose from his seat, suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled just slightly as they had been days earlier. "Thank you for coming," he said. The words were not perfunctory. They carried weight. Emily took a seat across from them, placing her small notebook on the polished table. "I am here to listen," she replied. The meeting began not with financial projections, but with Noah explaining his idea for a cartoon dinosaur mascot who taught children about allergies in simple language. Emily listened carefully, occasionally asking gentle questions that refined his concept rather than dismissing it. Daniel watched the exchange with quiet fascination. In boardrooms, people spoke to impress. Here, she spoke to improve. After Noah was escorted to a side room with an assistant and a stack of colored pencils, the tone shifted slightly. Daniel activated a screen displaying charts and funding allocations. "We currently invest over $5 million annually in medical research grants," he explained. "However, community outreach remains underdeveloped." Emily leaned forward, studying the numbers without intimidation. "Research saves lives long-term," she said thoughtfully. "But awareness saves them immediately." Daniel nodded slowly. "How would you structure it?" She described partnerships with public schools, free training sessions for teachers, accessible digital resources for parents. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, not louder, but more certain. She was no longer the waitress at a small table near a window. She was the future physician who had been paused, not erased. Daniel found himself absorbing more than strategy. He absorbed conviction. "You should lead this initiative," he said finally. The statement hung between them. Emily blinked once, surprised but not flattered. "I am not finished with school," she replied. "Leadership does not require a diploma," Daniel countered gently. "It requires clarity." Silence settled again, but this time it felt expansive rather than tense. Outside, traffic lights shifted from green to red in steady cycles, tiny constellations beneath them. Emily closed her notebook slowly. "If I accept," she said carefully, "I do so with conditions." Daniel almost smiled at the familiarity of that phrase. "I am listening." "No publicity without purpose," she stated. "No photo opportunities that turn children into headlines. And funding allocated transparently." Daniel held her gaze. In his world, conditions were negotiated aggressively. Here, they were presented as principles. "Agreed," he said without hesitation. The simplicity of his answer surprised even him. For years, he had guarded authority like armor. Now he found himself willing to share it. Noah burst back into the room unexpectedly, holding up a drawing of a bright red dinosaur wearing a small white doctor's coat. "What do you think?" he asked breathlessly. Emily knelt beside him, studying the image with genuine admiration. "I think he looks prepared," she said softly. Daniel watched them together, a subtle warmth spreading through his chest. The room, once defined by glass walls and strategic plans, now felt almost human. Later, as the meeting concluded and assistants began gathering documents, Daniel walked Emily to the elevator. The hallway was quiet, carpeted footsteps muted against the late hour. "You were right," he said quietly as they waited. "Anger is often fear in disguise." Emily glanced at him, surprised by the reflection. "And humility?" she asked gently. "Is sometimes the beginning of change," he replied. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. She stepped inside, turning to face him as the doors began to close. "This is not charity," she reminded him one last time. Daniel's expression softened. "No," he said. "It is partnership." As the elevator descended, Emily felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not obligation, not pressure, possibility. Above, Daniel remained standing in the hallway longer than necessary, watching the numbers drop until they disappeared from view. He had spent years believing control was strength. Yet tonight, strength felt different. It felt like trust extended, like authority shared, like a woman who had once stood accused under chandelier light, now standing confidently in a room designed for power. And somewhere between a child's drawing of a dinosaur and a billionaire's quiet concession, a foundation was forming that neither of them had planned, steady and unspoken, built not from contracts but from mutual respect that was beginning, slowly, to resemble something deeper. 2 weeks later, the first pilot workshop launched in a public elementary school in Queens, far from the polished marble floors of Whitmore Tower and even farther from the chandelier glow of the restaurant where everything had begun. The gymnasium smelled faintly of floor wax and cafeteria lunches, folding chairs arranged in neat rows beneath a basketball hoop that had seen better days. A colorful banner stretched across one wall, painted by students in bright red and blue letters that read, "Breathe, Easy Day." At the center of it all stood a cartoon dinosaur in a white coat, drawn almost exactly like Noah's original sketch. Emily adjusted the projector cables with steady hands while a group of second graders whispered excitedly from the bleachers. She wore a simple navy dress and low heels, her hair tied back as always, but there was a difference in her posture. Not guarded, not cautious, grounded. Daniel Whitmore stood near the back of the gym beside the principal, his tailored suit slightly out of place against the scuffed hardwood floor. He had declined the podium. He had declined the press. This was not a publicity event. It was a beginning. Noah sat cross-legged among the students, clutching a small stack of printed booklets titled, "Know Before You Eat." When Emily stepped forward to begin speaking, the room quieted in that natural way children quiet when someone earns attention without demanding it. "Sometimes," she began, her voice warm but clear, "our bodies react to things that look harmless." She held up a simple image of a peanut. "That does not make our bodies weak. It makes them unique." Daniel watched as she moved through the presentation with calm precision, explaining allergic reactions in language simple enough for a 7-year-old, yet respectful enough not to sound condescending. She invited questions. She listened. She knelt to eye level when a nervous child admitted he was afraid to eat at birthday parties. "Preparation is not fear," she said gently. "Preparation is power." The words echoed softly in Daniel's mind. He had built his empire on preparation, yet he had never framed it with such compassion. When the workshop ended, teachers approached with gratitude that felt genuine rather than performative. A school nurse asked about additional resources. A parent requested copies of the booklet. Emily handled each conversation without seeking recognition. Daniel stepped forward only when necessary, answering logistical questions, committing funding where needed. But the center of gravity remained hers. Outside the school, late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the sidewalk. Noah ran ahead, laughing, waving a booklet like a trophy. "It worked," he declared proudly. Daniel and Emily walked a few steps behind him, the city noise rising around them in steady rhythm. "You were remarkable," Daniel said quietly. Emily shook her head lightly. "They were ready to learn," she replied. "I only gave them language." He studied her profile as they waited at the crosswalk, the wind lifting a few loose strands of her hair. "You have a way of making complex things feel human," he said. She glanced at him, faint amusement touching her eyes. "You make complex things profitable," she answered. The light shifted from red to green. They crossed together. There was ease now where tension once lived. Days blended into a pattern of collaboration. Emily spent mornings at the restaurant, afternoons reviewing program materials, evenings studying for the medical school entrance exam. Daniel adjusted his schedule without announcement, appearing at meetings less as chairman and more as partner. They disagreed occasionally, on budget allocations, on scale, on speed. But disagreement no longer felt like conflict. It felt like refinement. One evening, as they stood alone in the quiet conference room overlooking the city, reviewing expansion plans for additional schools, silence settled comfortably between them. The skyline shimmered beyond the glass, lights flickering like distant constellations. Daniel set his pen down. "You have changed this foundation," he said. "You have changed me." The admission was not dramatic. It was steady. Emily met his gaze, searching for exaggeration. She found none. "You chose to change," she replied softly. "That matters." He stepped closer, not intruding, simply narrowing the space that had gradually diminished over weeks of shared purpose. "I reacted out of fear that night," he said. "You responded with courage. Since then, I have been trying to understand the difference." Emily felt her pulse shift, not from pressure, but from awareness. "Courage is rarely loud," she said. "It is often quiet, consistent." Daniel's voice lowered slightly. "And what would you call this?" The question was gentle, unguarded. Not a negotiation, an invitation. Emily hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Mutual respect," she answered first. Then, after a beat that stretched just long enough to matter, and something that could become more. The honesty lingered in the air, as fragile and strong as the city lights beyond them. Daniel reached for her hand slowly, giving her space to withdraw if she wished. She did not. Her fingers fit into his with natural ease, not as charity, not as obligation, but as choice. The moment held no audience, no headlines, no applause. Just two people who had met in crisis and discovered clarity instead. Below them, traffic flowed along Park Avenue, relentless and bright. Above them, the night deepened. And in the quiet space between preparation and possibility, between authority and humility, something real began to take root, steady as breath, built not from power, but from partnership that had quietly, unmistakably, grown into love. Autumn arrived quietly in Manhattan, not with dramatic temperature drops, but with subtle changes in light, in the way the air felt thinner and cleaner as it moved between buildings. The Whitmore Foundation's Pediatric Allergy Initiative had expanded to 12 schools across 3 boroughs, and what had begun as a single pilot workshop now moved with steady momentum. Emily Carter stood on the rooftop terrace of Whitmore Tower one late afternoon, reviewing a stack of revised training manuals while the wind brushed gently against the city skyline behind her. Below, traffic hummed in patient lines, taxis weaving between buses, life unfolding in ordinary patterns. Inside the glass doors, Daniel Whitmore concluded a meeting with board members who had initially questioned the redirection of funds toward community education. They no longer questioned it. The data spoke clearly. Emergency incidents in participating schools had declined. Training participation had exceeded projections. But what statistics could not measure was the shift in culture. Preparation had become empowerment. Daniel stepped onto the terrace, loosening his tie slightly as he approached her. They approved full expansion, he said, not with triumph, but with quiet satisfaction. Emily looked up, sunlight catching in her eyes. That was inevitable, she replied. Results tend to persuade. He studied her for a moment, noticing the faint crease between her brows when she concentrated. You sound more like a strategist every week, he observed. She smiled lightly. I learned from one. The ease between them had deepened over the past month, no longer tentative, no longer exploratory. They had shared long evenings reviewing grant proposals, early mornings at schools, and simple dinners at small neighborhood restaurants where no one recognized Daniel and no one cared. Power had softened into presence. Medical school interviews begin in January, Daniel said carefully. Are you prepared? Emily closed the folder and leaned against the railing, looking out over the Hudson River in the distance. Prepared enough, she answered. I studied between shifts for 2 years. I can handle interviews. He nodded slowly. And the restaurant? I will finish the semester there, she said. I owe them that. Daniel considered her loyalty, the way she refused to discard chapters of her life simply because new ones opened. You do not have to carry everything alone, he said quietly. She turned toward him fully now, the wind lifting her hair slightly. I am not alone, she replied. The words were simple, but their weight settled gently between them. That evening, Noah joined them for dinner on the terrace, bundled in a light jacket, proudly announcing that his dinosaur mascot had been printed on thousands of educational flyers. He spoke with the unfiltered confidence of a child who felt safe. Daniel watched his son laugh beside Emily and felt something shift again, something steadier than excitement. It was not the thrill of acquisition or the adrenaline of competition. It was continuity. After Noah was escorted inside by his tutor, the terrace grew quiet. City lights blinked on one by one as dusk deepened. Emily stepped closer to the railing, resting her hands lightly on the cool metal. When I was 12, she said softly, I thought my life would be predictable. Medical school, residency, hospital work. I did not imagine this path. Daniel moved to stand beside her, leaving just enough space to respect choice. Do you regret it? He asked. She shook her head gently. No. Every detour taught me something. Even the restaurant. He allowed himself a small smile. Especially the restaurant, he corrected. She glanced at him, understanding the shared reference without words. Fear can close doors, she said thoughtfully. But it can also redirect you to the right one. Daniel exhaled slowly, watching the reflection of lights ripple across nearby windows. You once said anger is fear in disguise, he reminded her. I have been thinking about that. She waited. He rarely spoke about himself without calculation. For years, he continued, I built systems to prevent uncertainty. Contracts, safeguards, layers of control. But that night in the restaurant, I realized I could not control everything. I could only choose how to respond. Emily's voice softened. And you chose to come back. He looked at her fully now, no guardedness, no performance. I chose to listen. The silence that followed felt warm rather than heavy. Wind moved gently across the terrace, carrying the distant sound of a fairy horn from the river. Daniel reached for her hand again, the gesture no longer tentative. She intertwined her fingers with his without hesitation. When you begin medical school, he said quietly, your schedule will change. Your life will accelerate. I do not want to slow it. Emily's expression grew thoughtful. You are not slowing me, she replied. You are walking beside me. The distinction settled with clarity. Below them, the city continued its endless motion, unaware that on a quiet rooftop above Park Avenue, two lives had aligned in ways neither had planned. The path ahead would not be simple. Medical school would demand discipline. The foundation would demand oversight. Parenthood would demand patience. But complexity no longer intimidated Daniel the way it once had. He had learned that strength did not always mean control. Sometimes it meant trust. And as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared faintly beyond the city glow, Emily rested her head gently against his shoulder, not seeking rescue, not offering rescue, but sharing balance. In that quiet space between ambition and affection, between preparation and possibility, their partnership deepened into something enduring, steady as breath, certain as the skyline that framed them both. Winter settled over New York in quiet layers, not dramatic but deliberate, dusting rooftops in pale white and softening the edges of the city skyline. The rooftop terrace where Daniel Whitmore and Emily Carter had once stood beneath autumn light was now edged with frost, the metal railing cool beneath gloved hands. Inside Whitmore Tower, holiday decorations glowed discreetly in silver and white, understated but elegant. Life had accelerated in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Emily's medical school interviews had begun, each one requiring focus sharpened by years of delayed ambition. She studied late into the night at the townhouse library after finishing her shifts, textbooks spread across the polished desk, highlighter marks mapping her future. Daniel often remained nearby, reviewing foundation proposals in companionable silence. They did not distract each other. They steadied each other. One evening, as snow drifted steadily beyond the tall windows, Emily closed her laptop and exhaled slowly. Columbia was intense, she said quietly. They asked why I left. They asked if I was still committed. Daniel looked up from a stack of documents, studying the tension in her shoulders. And what did you say? She leaned back in the leather chair, staring at the ceiling briefly before answering. I said commitment is not proven by uninterrupted paths. It is proven by returning. Daniel felt the weight of that statement. It mirrored his own transformation more than she realized. They would be foolish not to see that, he said. She offered a faint smile, though uncertainty lingered behind it. For the first time since he had known her, doubt traced the edges of her composure. What if I am too late? She asked softly. The question was not dramatic. It was human. Daniel rose from his seat and crossed the room, stopping just close enough to offer presence without pressure. You stepped into a crisis and acted without hesitation, he reminded her. You built a program that now protects thousands of children. You carried responsibility before it was offered to you. That is not too late. That is readiness. She met his gaze, the reassurance settling gradually rather than instantly. Outside, a car horn echoed faintly against the snow-muffled streets. Upstairs, Noah practiced piano scales, each note slightly uneven but determined. Life continued in layered rhythms. Days later, a large envelope arrived at Emily's apartment in Queens. She stared at it for several seconds before opening it, fingers steady but breath measured. Daniel stood beside her in the narrow kitchen, the radiator humming softly against the winter chill. The letter unfolded with crisp clarity. Congratulations. Acceptance. Full admission to Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. Emily read the words twice, as though ensuring they would not disappear. She did not shout. She did not cry. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled, years of quiet perseverance releasing in a single breath. Daniel watched the moment unfold with profound awareness. You returned, he said gently. She opened her eyes, laughter finally breaking through. I returned, she echoed. The next evening, they celebrated not in a grand ballroom, but in the same restaurant where everything had shifted months before. Thomas greeted them warmly. Staff members who once whispered about her dismissal now congratulated her openly. Noah insisted on ordering dessert first, declaring it a special occasion rule. Emily glanced around the dining room, remembering the night fear had dominated the air, remembering the word fired spoken with sharp authority. It felt distant now, transformed by what had followed. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, not for display, not for reassurance, but because it felt natural. "I am proud of you," he said quietly. "Not for succeeding, for persisting." She squeezed his hand gently. "I did not do it alone," she replied. "You did not solve my path. You supported it." The distinction mattered. Later, as they stepped outside into the cold night air, snowflakes drifting beneath streetlights, Noah ran ahead once again, laughter trailing behind him. Daniel lingered beside Emily on the sidewalk, the city stretching endlessly around them. "Medical school will change everything," he said thoughtfully. "Schedules, demands, priorities." She looked up at him, confidence no longer tinged with doubt. "It will change logistics," she said. "Not intention." He nodded slowly, understanding that love, like preparation, required steadiness rather than spectacle. The foundation continued to expand under her guidance. Applications were filed. Plans were drawn. Life did not slow. It deepened. And as the snow continued to fall, softening the noise of traffic and turning the city briefly quiet, Daniel realized that the night he had once believed marked a loss of control had, in truth, marked the beginning of alignment. Emily had stepped into his world without being absorbed by it. She had strengthened it without surrendering herself. And standing there beneath winter lights, their fingers intertwined against the cold, he understood that what began with a moment of crisis had grown into something neither fragile nor fleeting, but rooted and enduring, steady as breath against the winter air. Spring arrived not with fanfare, but with thaw, the last sheets of snow dissolving into narrow streams along Manhattan sidewalks. Columbia University's campus carried the restless energy of a new academic year as Emily Carter walked beneath budding trees, a leather satchel slung over her shoulder, anatomy textbooks heavier than they appeared. Her first weeks of medical school moved quickly, lectures beginning at 8 in the morning, lab sessions stretching into late afternoons, study groups forming in quiet library corners where ambition hummed like low-voltage electricity. She adjusted to the pace without complaint. Fatigue touched her eyes some evenings, but it never reached her posture. Daniel Whitmore noticed the difference immediately. He no longer measured his days solely in board meetings and acquisition reports. Instead, he measured them in the small pauses between her classes when she called from campus, voice calm but tired, describing a complex case study or a challenging professor. He listened more than he advised. In the townhouse library, stacks of medical journals now shared space with foundation documents, the two worlds overlapping naturally rather than competing. One evening, as golden light filtered through tall windows and painted the hardwood floors in soft amber, Emily sat cross-legged on the rug reviewing flashcards while Noah completed his homework nearby. Daniel entered quietly, setting his briefcase down without announcement. He paused, observing the scene before speaking. "How many muscles in the human body?" he asked casually. Emily glanced up, faint amusement flickering across her face. "Approximately 650, she answered without hesitation. Noah grinned. "She wins again," he declared. Daniel shook his head slightly, impressed despite himself. "You make it look effortless," he said once Noah retreated upstairs. Emily closed her notebook, flexing her fingers slightly from hours of writing. "It is not effortless," she replied. "It is consistent." He sat beside her on the floor rather than choosing the leather chair behind his desk. "Consistency has always been your strength," he said quietly. "Not just in medicine." She studied him for a moment, sensing the unspoken layer beneath his words. "You have been adjusting too," she observed. Daniel exhaled softly. "I have been learning to schedule around something that matters more than expansion reports." The honesty was not grand, but it was real. Weeks later, the foundation hosted a formal gala to celebrate the success of the Allergy Awareness Initiative. Unlike previous events, this one carried different energy. It was less about prestige and more about purpose. Teachers from participating schools attended alongside investors. Parents spoke about reduced emergency incidents. Children proudly wore small dinosaur pins on their jackets. Emily stood near the center of the ballroom, dressed in a simple, deep blue gown that reflected understated elegance rather than spectacle. Daniel remained close, not possessive, not performative, simply aligned. When he took the stage briefly, his remarks were concise. "Preparation is power," he said, echoing her words from that first school workshop. "And power, when shared, becomes protection." Applause followed, warm rather than obligatory. He stepped down and returned to her side without lingering under the lights. Later that night, as the ballroom emptied and city traffic shimmered beyond tall windows, Emily leaned lightly against the terrace railing once more. The season had shifted from winter frost to spring air. Daniel joined her, removing his jacket and draping it gently around her shoulders against the cool breeze. "When I first walked back into that restaurant," he said thoughtfully, "I believed I was correcting a mistake." She turned toward him, listening. "Now I understand I was correcting myself." Emily felt the weight of the statement settle deeply. "Growth is rarely dramatic," she replied. "It is usually a series of small decisions." He reached into his pocket slowly, not with urgency, not with spectacle. What he withdrew was not a grand diamond or a theatrical gesture, but a simple ring of white gold, understated, deliberate. He did not kneel. He did not command the moment. He stood before her with steady eyes. "I do not want to interrupt your path," he said quietly. "I want to walk it with you. Not as rescue, not as obligation, as choice. Will you continue choosing this life with me?" The city noise faded into distant hum. Emily looked at the ring, then at him, recalling the journey that had begun beneath crystal chandeliers and sharp accusations. She saw not the billionaire who had once reacted in anger, but the man who had returned, who had listened, who had adjusted his world to include rather than dominate hers. "Yes," she answered softly. Not impulsive, not hesitant. Certain. Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, the metal catching faint terrace light. Below them, traffic flowed, indifferent and constant. Above them, the sky deepened into twilight. There were no fireworks, no spectacle, only two people standing shoulder to shoulder, having chosen humility over pride, partnership over power. And in the quiet space between ambition and affection, between preparation and possibility, they understood that what had begun with crisis had evolved into commitment, steady and enduring, as natural as breath carried through spring air. The morning after the ring found its place on Emily Carter's finger, Manhattan did not change. Taxis still leaned into impatient horns. Steam still rose from subway grates. Whitmore Tower still reflected the sky in sharp lines of glass and steel. Yet for Daniel Whitmore, the city felt subtly recalibrated, as though every familiar structure now carried an undercurrent of meaning. He stood in his office overlooking Park Avenue, hands resting lightly on the back of a leather chair, watching early sunlight cut between buildings. The ring had not been dramatic. It had not been broadcast. It had been chosen, and that choice settled into him with steady certainty. Downstairs in the townhouse kitchen, Emily poured coffee into 2 white mugs, her anatomy textbook open beside the stove. Engagement did not suspend medical school. It did not pause ambition. It simply added another dimension to it. Noah bounded into the kitchen moments later, hair still slightly tousled from sleep, stopping short when he noticed the subtle glint on her hand. "Is that official?" he asked, eyes wide with unmistakable curiosity. Emily knelt to his level, holding out her hand so he could inspect the simple white gold band. "It is official," she said softly. Noah looked from her to his father, who had just entered the room, and grinned in open approval. "Good," he declared, "because you already act like family." Daniel felt that statement settle more deeply than any boardroom applause ever had. The weeks that followed moved with layered momentum. Emily adjusted to the rhythm of medical school lectures, clinical observation hours, and foundation advisory meetings without losing balance. Daniel restructured segments of his calendar not out of obligation but intention, protecting time for dinner conversations and late-night study sessions. The townhouse library transformed gradually into a shared command center. One desk held financial projections and philanthropic outlines. The other held flashcards, skeletal diagrams, and practice case analyses. 2 worlds intersected without collision. One evening in early summer, Emily returned from a long day at Columbia with faint exhaustion lining her eyes. She set her bag down quietly, slipping off her heels near the door. Daniel noticed immediately. "You skipped lunch," he said, not accusatory, simply observant. She paused, faint amusement flickering despite fatigue. "I forgot," she admitted. He did not lecture. He walked into the kitchen and returned minutes later with a simple plate of grilled chicken and vegetables, placing it beside her open notebook. "Preparation includes nutrition," he said gently. She smiled at the familiar echo of her own words. Partnership, she realized, was not grand gestures. It was small consistencies repeated without being asked. Meanwhile, the foundation expanded beyond New York. Pilot programs launched in Boston, Chicago, and Seattle. Each city adapted the allergy awareness curriculum to its own school systems. Emily reviewed digital modules late at night, occasionally falling asleep over her laptop until Daniel closed it gently and guided her toward rest. The engagement ring became less an ornament and more an anchor, a quiet reminder that ambition did not require isolation. In late August, the townhouse hosted a small gathering for close friends and colleagues. No press, no spectacle, just a garden lit softly with string lights and low conversation. Thomas from the restaurant attended, along with several teachers from the First Queen's workshop. Emily stood near the fountain, listening as a school nurse described how a child had confidently explained his allergy to classmates using the dinosaur booklet. Daniel watched her from across the lawn, noticing how naturally she bridged worlds that once seemed incompatible. At one point, she caught his gaze across the garden. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. Their understanding had matured beyond verbal reassurance. As autumn approached again, marking nearly a year since that charged night under chandelier light, Daniel found himself reflecting more often. He returned once alone to Whitmore's Prime Steakhouse, sitting briefly at the same table where anger had once overtaken clarity. The restaurant carried its usual rhythm. Silverware clinked. Waitstaff moved efficiently. He traced the edge of a water glass lightly and allowed memory to surface without resistance. He had believed power meant control. He had believed authority meant certainty. He had been wrong. Control had not saved his son. Courage had. And courage had come from a woman who refused to be diminished by his fear. Later that evening, he shared that reflection with Emily as they walked along the Hudson River, autumn wind brushing gently against their coats. "I am grateful for that mistake," he said quietly. She glanced at him, surprised. "Mistakes are rarely comfortable," she replied. "But they can be instructive." He nodded slowly. "You did not argue when I dismissed you," he recalled. "You focused on Noah." Emily stopped walking, turning toward him fully. "Because that was the priority," she said. "Not my pride." He felt the depth of that truth once more. Pride had once defined him. Now purpose did. Winter returned gradually, bringing with it another layer of responsibility. Emily's coursework intensified, clinical rotations demanding longer hours. Daniel adjusted again, without complaint, preparing dinners when she arrived home late, attending foundation meetings independently when her schedule conflicted. They did not compete for attention. They complemented it. On the anniversary of the foundation's first school workshop, they returned to the same Queen's Elementary Gymnasium. The dinosaur banner hung freshly repainted, colors brighter than before. Children gathered once more, some now confident enough to stand and share their experiences. Emily spoke again, her voice steady, more seasoned. Daniel remained at the back of the room, as always, observing rather than commanding. When applause filled the gym at the end of the session, it was not for wealth or recognition. It was for impact. That evening, as snow began to fall lightly once more, Daniel and Emily stood on the rooftop terrace where he had once offered a ring without spectacle. The city below shimmered beneath winter lights. "Do you ever wonder," Daniel asked quietly, "what would have happened if I had not come back the next day?" Emily considered the question carefully. "You would have continued building," she said, "and I would have continued studying. We might have remained strangers who crossed paths briefly." He exhaled slowly. "I am glad we did not." She stepped closer, resting her gloved hands lightly against his chest. "So am I." The wind moved around them, cold but clean. Daniel understood now that wealth could construct buildings, but humility constructed bridges. Emily understood that ambition could chart a path, but partnership sustained it. They did not know precisely what the next decade would hold. Medical residency would test patience. Foundation expansion would test leadership. Parenthood would test adaptability. Yet uncertainty no longer frightened them. It invited preparation. And preparation, as she had once told a room full of second graders, was power. Below them, the city pulsed with endless movement. Above them, the sky stretched vast and unguarded. Between those two expanses stood a billionaire who had learned to listen and a future physician who had never forgotten how to act. Their story had not been written by spectacle or status, but by a sequence of quiet decisions, to respond rather than react, to return rather than retreat, to choose respect over pride, and love over control. And as winter deepened around the skyline, they stood together in steady alignment, aware that the most transformative moments rarely arrive announced. They arrive in silence, in courage, in the simple act of coming back the next day. The city moved towards spring again, not in sudden warmth but in subtle thaw, the air softening along the Hudson and sunlight lingering a little longer against the glass of Whitmore Tower. Nearly a year and a half had passed since the night everything shifted beneath chandelier light, and time had layered their lives with depth rather than distance. Emily's second year of medical school had begun with clinical rotations that carried her into hospital corridors before sunrise. She walked those halls with quiet focus, white coat pressed, stethoscope resting against her collarbone like a promise she had finally reclaimed. Daniel often woke before her, preparing coffee in the townhouse kitchen while reviewing early market updates, but his attention no longer lingered solely on numbers. It lingered on her schedule taped neatly beside the refrigerator, on the nights she returned exhausted yet steady, on the way she described patients not as cases but as stories. One evening, rain tapped lightly against the townhouse windows while she sat at the dining table reviewing cardiology notes. Her engagement ring caught faint. Reflections from the chandelier above, subtle but constant. Daniel entered quietly, setting aside his phone without announcement. Long day, he observed. She nodded, rubbing her temple gently. A 12-hour shift, she replied. I assisted during an emergency consult. Not dramatic. Just urgent. He noticed the difference in her tone, the way urgency did not rattle her. You were calm, he asked. A faint smile touched her lips. Calm is contagious, she said. If I panic, everyone feels it. He recognized that quality immediately. It was the same steadiness she had carried into a crowded restaurant months ago, the same steadiness that had altered his life. Across the table, Noah worked on a science project about the respiratory system, carefully labeling each lung segment with colored pencil. Emily, he asked suddenly, looking up, does breathing ever stop being important? She paused, considering the simplicity of the question. No, she answered gently. It is the one thing we cannot ignore. Daniel felt the words settle deeper than their literal meaning. Breathing, presence, attention. The fundamentals had always mattered more than display. Weeks later, the Whitmore Foundation expanded into international partnerships, bringing allergy awareness programs to schools in Canada and the United Kingdom. Board members praised Daniel's strategic foresight, but he redirected recognition publicly. This initiative began with observation, he stated during a meeting. With someone who chose to act rather than wait. Emily did not seek applause. She continued refining educational modules between study sessions, ensuring language remained accessible rather than academic. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, they visited the Queen's Elementary School where the first workshop had been held. The dinosaur banner had faded slightly with time, edges curling at the corners. Children now recognized Emily not as a waitress or consultant, but as Dr. Carter in progress. She knelt beside a small group explaining food labels, listening to their questions with patient clarity. Daniel stood nearby, hands in his coat pockets, observing how naturally she inhabited this role. Afterward, as they stepped outside beneath a pale blue sky, he turned to her. You never lost yourself, he said quietly. She looked at him with mild confusion. In what way? In my world, he clarified. You entered it without dissolving into it. She considered his words thoughtfully. Identity is not surrendered, she replied. It is shared. That evening, back at the townhouse, they began discussing something they had postponed amid busy schedules. The wedding. Not a spectacle. Not a corporate event disguised as celebration. Something intentional. Something reflective of who they had become. Small, Emily said firmly. Family. Friends. The teachers from Queens. Daniel nodded without hesitation. Agreed. He no longer equated scale with significance. Preparations unfolded gradually. Invitations handwritten. Venue selected overlooking the Hudson at sunset. No press coverage. No exclusive interviews. The focus remained inward. One night, as they reviewed final details, Daniel paused mid-sentence. "Do you ever think about that first moment?" he asked. Emily knew exactly which moment he meant. "Sometimes," she admitted. "It reminds me how quickly assumptions can shape outcomes." He reached for her hand across the table, fingers brushing the ring that had once felt new and now felt inevitable. "You changed the outcome," he said. She shook her head gently. "We both did. You chose to return." Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the quiet transformation that had unfolded within its boundaries. Engagement had matured into partnership. Partnership had deepened into commitment. Not rushed, not forced, built steadily through shared purpose and mutual respect. As wedding day approached, Daniel found himself less concerned with logistics and more aware of gratitude. Gratitude for a woman who had met fear with composure. Gratitude for a son who had unknowingly bridged worlds. Gratitude for the understanding that power without humility was incomplete. On the eve of their ceremony, they stood once more on the rooftop terrace, the skyline stretching endlessly before them. "Are you nervous?" Daniel asked softly. Emily considered the question beneath the open sky. "No," she replied. "Certain." He smiled, recognizing the same certainty that had once guided her hands in a moment of crisis. The city lights flickered below like steady heartbeats, constant and alive. And as they stood there, side by side, they understood that what awaited them was not perfection, not immunity from challenge, but alignment. A life chosen deliberately. A future built not from status or spectacle, but from the quiet strength of two people who had learned that sometimes the most powerful act is not commanding a room, but returning to it with humility and staying. The wedding morning unfolded in quiet light along the Hudson River, not with spectacle, but with clarity. The sky carried a pale gold glow, soft clouds drifting above the water, as if the city itself had paused to breathe. Chairs were arranged in simple rows facing the river, white linen moving gently in the early breeze. No towering floral arches. No extravagant display. Just intention. Emily Carter stood in a modest room overlooking the shoreline, her gown understated and elegant, ivory fabric falling in clean lines that reflected her own quiet strength. She fastened a pair of simple pearl earrings and studied her reflection not with vanity, but with awareness. This was not the girl tying an apron behind a restaurant counter. This was not the student juggling textbooks at midnight. This was a woman who had chosen her path and chosen her partner without surrendering either. Downstairs, Daniel Whitmore adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, the same deliberate motion he once used before stepping into boardrooms filled with negotiation. But this morning carried no strategy, only presence. Noah stood beside him, small tie slightly crooked, eyes bright with anticipation. "Do not mess this up," Noah whispered with playful seriousness. Daniel smiled, kneeling to straighten the tie carefully. "I have learned," he replied softly, "that the most important moments are the ones you approach with humility." Guests arrived quietly. Teachers from Queens, nurses from Columbia, Thomas from the restaurant who had once stood frozen between authority and confusion, members of the foundation board who had witnessed transformation rather than merely funded it. When the music began, soft and steady, Emily stepped forward along the aisle lined with people who had become witnesses to growth rather than spectacle. Daniel watched her approach, sunlight catching faintly against her hair, and felt no rush of dominance, no surge of control, only gratitude. She reached him, and for a moment neither spoke. The river moved behind them, constant and unhurried. The officiant's words were simple, focused not on grandeur, but on partnership. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, his voice carried clarity rather than performance. "You met fear with courage," he said. "You answered anger with steadiness. You stepped into my world without losing yourself, and in doing so, you changed mine. I promise not to overshadow your ambition, but to stand beside it. I promise to return, even on difficult days. I promise to listen before I react." Emily's response carried the same quiet strength. "You chose to come back," she said. "You chose humility over pride. You chose partnership over control. I promise to support your growth as fiercely as you supported mine. I promise to speak truth even when it is uncomfortable. And I promise to build a life where preparation is shared, not shouldered alone. Rings were exchanged not as symbols of possession, but of alignment. Applause rose gently, blending with the rhythm of the river. Noah grinned openly, clapping louder than anyone else. After the ceremony, guests gathered along the terrace, laughter weaving through soft music and conversation. No photographers rushed for stage perfection. Instead, teachers spoke with Daniel about expanding programs to additional districts. Columbia colleagues congratulated Emily on her clinical progress. Thomas raised a glass quietly, recalling the night he had almost signed a termination form without question. Later, as evening descended and the sky shifted from gold to deep blue, Daniel and Emily slipped away briefly toward the water's edge. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, lights reflecting against the river's dark surface. For a long moment, they stood without speaking. It feels calm, Daniel observed. It feels certain, Emily corrected gently. He turned toward her, expression softened by understanding earned rather than inherited. Do you ever think about the chain of events? He asked quietly. How one decision could have closed everything. She nodded. Yes, she admitted. But I think more about the decision that reopened it. He took her hand, fingers interlacing naturally, no tension remaining between past and present. The wind carried the faint scent of water and city air, familiar and grounding. I once believed power meant being right, Daniel said thoughtfully. Now I understand it means being willing to be corrected. Emily smiled softly. And I once believed I had to carry everything alone, she replied. Now I understand strength multiplies when shared. The reception lights glowed warmly behind them, voices rising in easy conversation. In the distance, a ferry moved steadily along the river, its path illuminated against the night. Life continued. Markets would open tomorrow. Lectures would resume. Foundation meetings would demand attention. Parenthood would require patience. But none of it felt overwhelming. Because the foundation beneath it all had been tested not by ease, but by misunderstanding, humility, and return. As they walked back toward their guests, Daniel glanced once more at the skyline that had once represented conquest. It no longer felt like something to dominate. It felt like something to serve. Emily stepped beside him, matching pace effortlessly. And beneath the quiet arc of city lights, they entered their reception not as a billionaire and a former waitress, not as power and resistance, but as two people who had chosen to respond with courage, to return with respect, and to build a life where the quiet ones were never truly ordinary. If this story touched you, remember that strength is not always loud, and love is not always dramatic. Sometimes it begins with humility, a second chance, and the courage to return. If you believe in dignity, growth, and quiet transformation, share where you are watching from and share this story with someone who needs it. And do not forget to like and subscribe to Love After Everything channel for more touching stories where power meets humanity and hearts choose wisdom over pride.